bar graphs, right? Now, bar graphs are pretty simple. They're just basically data that's represented by bars, right? So let's take a look at this graph here. For a bar graph, there are basically three things that we need, right? We must have or number one, a title, right? And then for the sides, we must also have titles, okay? And then finally, we must have our bars that represent the amount of stuff that we have for each category. And you'll notice that either on the x-axis here, going from left to right, our x-axis, sometimes we have the definitions of the different things that we're measuring, right? And then on the up and down, which is what we normally see in newspapers and stuff, we usually have the amount of stuff that we have for each category. Okay? Now, in this case, along the x-axis, we have students. Along the y-axis, we actually have the missed days. Now, these graphs can also be tilted to be, they can actually be tilted sideways and measured from left to right instead of up and down like we have here. And this is what we're talking about right here. So let's just quickly look at this and then we'll go back and answer some questions. So if we look at this bar graph here, right? This bar graph is the exact same graph, but all we did was we turned it on its side where we had our categories on the XY. Sorry, the y-axis. And then we had our missed days on the x-axis. Now, you can easily read it. You can say, okay, student 3 has a certain amount, student 2 has a certain amount, and student 1 has a certain amount. Okay? Now, if we go back here, let's see if we can answer some questions about this. If I looked at this graph, right, I could ask you questions about this graph. If I asked you, what do we know about student 1? If I was looking at that and I asked you, what do you know about student number 1? You should be able to look at the graph and tell me how many missed days student 1 has. Any of you, one of you guys, type in that answer for me, please. I'd love to know how many days student 1 has missed. Quickly. Excellent. Good answer. So we have 8. For student 2, tell me what student 2 has for its missed dates. 5. Good job. And student 3? Has 9 missed days. Now, how did we get 9? If we look at our graph here, what's actually happening is we actually have a line, we have our bar that actually goes across this thing, but you know what? It doesn't show up at a specific part that is measured, right? So we actually draw a line across and you can see that it's halfway between 8 and 10, so it's got to be 9. Now, like I said before, like I mentioned before, every chart must have one thing called a title, right? You must have the sides labeled, like we said. And of course, with every bar chart, we must have the bars that represent each one of the categories. Okay. Now, let's take a look at this problem. So for most people, bar graphs are fairly straightforward, right? There's always a title at the top, like we said, as well as an x-axis that's labeled and a y-axis that's labeled, right? Now, remember, that has to happen. The x-axis and the y-axis must be labeled, right? And if those things are missing in any of our charts, you should be able to tell me that. And then if you don't have, say, the title, you should be able to put a title based on what you see in your chart or the description that I give you. Now, let's go and take a look at the horizontal bars for our graph up here. The horizontal is called the x-axis, right? And for that, you would say that this graph, if I was looking at it and I asked you what the x and y axes represent, you would say the horizontal. You could also say the x-axis is students. Nope, is Miss Days, actually, based on the graph, based on the horizontal bar graph. And it is Miss Days. Okay, now for the vertical, you could also call this the y-axis. You would tell me this is the students. And the students are identified by 1, 2, and 3. Now, let us move on to looking at a bar graph that you could possibly see in a newspaper or on the news. Now, like I said a long time ago, right? When you are looking at these things, these pictures give you as much information as possible without really saying a word, right? So I should be able to look at that graph and then make a decision based on the graph. So if I was looking at that graph up there, you should be able to tell me and answer this question here. Which country is the largest producer of barley? Anyone, tell me which one it is. We've got USSR, China, Germany. Yeah. So, what? The largest producer? The largest producer would have the longest bar. So which one has the longest bar? Yes, excellent. So the key concept is you'd know that the longest bar is USSR. So, and the reason why we know this is because it's the longest bar. Now, I'm going to give you the benefit of the doubt if you thought China was also the longest bar. And the reason why that is because if you look at it, you might not be able to discern or make a decision as to which graph is the farthest along. And we'd actually have to kind of zoom in and zoom in and zoom in order to see that. But if you weren't able to see it, you would guess that both of them had the same amount of barley that was created for each of the countries, right? And the reason why that is because the graphs the graphs are not quite exact. But they do give you an idea of how much is there. Now, if I was looking at this graph, you should be able to tell me which graph has the least amount of barley. Please tell me who makes the least amount of barley. All right. Let's see. Anyone? Excellent. I would say Japan. And it's clear to see that Japan is the lowest. because when we compare it to the next one above, it is actually a little shorter. And you would say Japan makes the least. So if you were writing this, you would actually try to write in full sentences when you wrote your solutions to these for me. All right? All right, now let's take a look at this. This one says, how much barley does Canada produce? So let's go and look at that. Remember, we're looking at how much barley does Canada produce. So let's zoom in and we'll look at Canada. And I'll bring out my handy dandy ruler. And what I'll do is I'll turn my ruler to about 90 degrees. Uh-oh. And then I'll just move it over till it touches the Canada bar. And then what I'm going to do, because it's kind of hard to read, I'm going to kind of draw a line along the edge right onto the line right here. Now remember, based on our graph literally has our countries here, which it's missing. And it also tells us the millions of bushels of barley that is made. Now, that number for Canada is somewhere between 50 and 100. Somebody give me a number for that. What do you think it is? Anybody? Anyone? You think, yeah, it's about that. Yes, it is. It is about that. Because it's in between 50 and 70, you're not quite sure. You always want to think it's about 75. So think of it as like this. If I have numbers from that jump every 50, every halfway mark is like a quarter. So you got 0, 25, 50, 75, 100, 125, 50, blah, 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 and it keeps going, right? So in this case, Canada's barley now has about 75. So Canada produces 75. Now we don't say 75. We say 75 million barrels. Millions of barrels. For our answer. Now, let's take a look at India. So when we're looking at India, what we got to do is we got to basically use what we've got here. Uh-oh. Oops, that's wrong. Oh, no. Oh, no. All right, so we're going to use India. And what we're going to do is we look for India. And India is right here. Okay? So for India, we're going to go and use our ruler again. Move it over to where India is. And draw a straight line down. Oh, boy. And we'll just draw a straight line down from India to the edge. Now, I'd like one of you guys to take a moment, look at that picture. I'm going to zoom out. Sorry, zoom in. Give me an idea of what you think this number is in between 100 and 150. Let me know. Anyone? Give me a number somewhere between 100 or, yeah, hey, very good. I would say this is, yep, I would say it's somewhere between 100 and 115. So you kind of guess. This is not exact, so I'd actually write down it's not exact. But India produces between, if you chose one of these two, you're golden. 110 million or 115 million barrels. That's it, right? So now once we have an idea of how many millions we have for each, we could actually figure out, say, the total amount, right? So the total amount means well, you're going to have to add them all up, right? So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to give you what I think each of the numbers are, okay? So for Japan, I'm going to say it's 170. For Canada, we have 175. Oh, you know what? Let's put all of this. I know what I'll do here. So I'll put all the numbers to the right. So Canada is 170. Japan is 170, 175 for Japan, for Canada. I want you guys to total these up, so get your calculators out. For Turkey, I think it's about 180. For Spain, we have about 105. For India, we said we had 115. For United States, I'm going to assume it's about 190. For Germany, I'm going to assume it's somewhere around, let's go 230. No, 220. And for China, we're going to have, let's say, 390, and I'll say this is 392. So what I want you guys to do is take a moment and add up all those numbers for me. I'll also do the same and try to make sure that I have the right numbers. All right, so let's go and check what's the total, because remember I asked you for the total amount that's there. So total them all up on your calculators. Plus 190 plus 115 plus 105 plus 180 plus 175 plus 170, and we get about a total of 37. So that would what our total would be. So if I was looking at this, I would say, how many is totaled by all the countries? I would say the totals are about 1,937, and you need to say millions of barrels. Barrels. So let's go over the final concept that we have to understand here. The key idea of this whole thing is that is that bar graphs can be represented vertically and horizontally, just like we had when we had these two graphs. We've got our vertical graph and we have our horizontal graph. Now, remember that each of your graphs will have a title at a top to describe what's actually happening. You're also going to have an x-axis at the bottom that tells us what's happening, and a y-axis as well, okay? And then we just have to read the graph. We just have to either read the bar by looking at how high or how far across the bar reaches, and that's basically what our tally is, right? Now, bar graphs are just a good use for when one of your variables doesn't need to be perfectly exact, but it gives you an idea in relation to the other things that are in your chart. So, for example, I could quickly look at this and say, which is the biggest producer? I should be able to figure out which is the smallest producer and which countries are kind of middle of the road. I should be able to do that by using these charts. Okay, now that's it. And today, when you do your lesson, remember, you need to identify and note that if your graph is missing any of the three concepts, the title and the two titles on the side, which tell us what is actually going on our chart, if that's missing, you have to identify that on your sheet. And then you can just answer the rest of the questions that are there for your worksheet.